Well, breaking news out of Europe this morning as well. Ireland announcing that it will take a 92% stake in Allied Irish Bank. It is the fourth lender that the government has taken control of in just 2 years. Elliott Gotkine is following that story for us from London. Elliott.
Betty, the Irish government already owned about a fifth of Allied Irish Banks, and now, as you say, its stake is going to rise to 92%. It's doing so by injecting €3.7 billion, just under $5 billion, into that bank. Coincidentally or not, perhaps this was the exact same amount that the European Commission said that Allied Irish Banks needed to raise to give it minimum capital standards. Now, that capital raising done, Allied Irish Bank still needs to raise a further €6 billion or so by the end of February in order to meet capital standards as well for Tier 1 capital ratios, money, if you like, the bank set aside in case of to cover the risk of assets going sour. And of course, no real surprise that the Irish government has boosted its stake in Allied Irish Banks, but perhaps the extent, the size of that stake, and indeed the fact that it's going to be delisting from the main Irish stock market and the London Stock Exchange, for example, that perhaps has scared off a few investors, and we've seen those shares tumbling this morning.
And Elliott, you were in Ireland throughout these EU-IMF bailout negotiations. I mean, is this capital injection just another part of the whole puzzle there?
Well, very much so. I mean, there was an €85 billion bailout, don't forget, from the EU, the IMF and the European Central Bank. The Irish government always said that its finances were perfectly fine. It had enough money to tide itself over until the middle of next year. But, of course, after having assumed most of the liabilities and, of course, all the deposits of the Irish banking system, those liabilities became the state, became the taxpayers' liabilities. And, of course, injecting this money into Allied Irish Banks is, of course, part of this process. The money that the Irish state needed. It needed partly to inject €35 billion into the Irish banking system to prevent it, of course, from collapsing, and, of course, to ensure that people are confident enough to keep their money in it and that these banks can start to lend to help the Irish economy grow itself out of its crisis.
Elliott, thank you. Elliott Gotkine in London.